Est-ce que le cinéma peut être un métier pur?
Ah, je crois, il est fait tellement de compromis que forcément on retrouve la pureté à la fin.
Purity through compromise captures exactly what made the French New Wave revolutionary. These filmmakers weren't chasing perfection, they were capturing life through the lens of a filmmaker. They did this with low budgets, political unrest, changing technology, on site filming locations, and a deep frustration and adoration with the studio system. But somehow, through these constraints, they created a cinema that felt more honest, more personal, more alive than anything that came before it. Today, I'm going to be breaking down the French New Wave and how it would go on to influence the Japanese New Wave and New Hollywood style. So, before we can talk about the movies and our directors and subsequently the following movements, we first have to know what was going on in history when this happened. So, here is the history of the French New Wave. Now, what is the French New Wave? So, the French New Wave, or Nouvelle Vogue in French, came onto the scene in the late 1950s after World War II. In 1946, French Prime Minister Leon Blum met with U.S. Secretary of State James F. Burns. They would come to an agreement to cancel France's $2 billion war debt. This resulted in the film market opening Hollywood movies up to French audiences. For some context, before this, France had implemented film quotas, where a certain amount of movies shown had to be French films. Thus, future French New Wave directors would develop their opinions and styles from these movies, alongside a bit of Italian neo-realism. Some notable inspirations to these future directors would be Alfred Hitchcock, Roberto Rossellini, Orson Welles, and Humphrey Bogart, along a long list of others that were praised in the Cahiers du Cinéma. What is the Cahiers du Cinéma? Well, started by André Bazin, it was a collection of new critics all in one journal. Almost all French New Wave directors got their start being critics. They did not go to school for filmmaking, instead, the theater was their teacher. It was in this that the auteur theory would take shape. What is auteur theory? In 1954, François Truffaut's essay Une certaine tendance du cinéma français, a certain tendency of French cinema, criticizes the cinema of quality, which stated that directors just adapt literary pieces for film. He believed that directors are the true artist and the screen is like their canvas. Another way to think about this is that you should be able to look at any scene in any movie and be able to tell who directed it just based off their unique style, whether that is framing, mise en scène, writing, directors, location, or etc. For my research, I interviewed UW Oshkosh radio TV film professor Dr. Karen Murphy, and here's what she had to say about auteur theory.
They don't want to make a movie that looks like the choices that Hitchcock would have made if he were making this film. They want to have their own signature approach. And I mean, I would say that's kind of easy to see when you look at French New Wave films. And it's easy to see too when you look at American directors in the Hollywood New Wave, late 60s and into the 70s. There's a story that they want to tell, but how you tell it is style, and a director wants to have his own style.
So what makes Nouvelle Vogue? In the book, Movie Posters, The History of Cinema from the Origins to the Present by Richard Dacker, he states, while there is no consistent aesthetic or style associated with the movement, its filmmakers were united in the wish to make personal films independent of the established industry. The other characteristics were natural light, on-site filming locations, handheld cameras, jump cuts, long takes, and improvisation from the actors and directors. And it wasn't that these ideas were new per se, but it was the conscientious effort by these directors to integrate them into their own filmic style.
And they wanted people who were watching the movies to think about the fact that there is somebody behind the camera. And so handheld camera or using things like jump cuts or using techniques like freeze frames. The goal of self-conscious technique is to grab the viewer's attention and make them aware somebody's hand is behind this. And that's the opposite of Hollywood style. Hollywood style is like watch a movie and escape into the story world. Forget.
They broke the rules that the industry had been following for decades prior. And it wasn't because they didn't know how to, they did it because they wanted to change. They wanted to be free. So taking all this into mind, how were they able to achieve their goal of making movies? This dream of filmmaking was made possible because of the new tools and opportunities that previous generations did not have. New lightweight cameras that had the advantage of being handheld and portable allowed for improvised camera movements and the ease of following the actors anywhere. This led to on-site filming locations. This idea was taken from Italian neorealism. It contrasted the expensive set filming of the studio system, thus eliminating studio costs, saving them their budget. It also created everyday realism, letting them capture real crowds and real city energy. The small budget also forced these directors to have to think creatively on how they'll achieve the look they wanted on a micro budget. Now that we have all that historical context in mind, let's take a look at our 3 French directors and their movies that would go on to inspire future directors. For this project, I decided to choose François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, and Agnès Varda. For this, let's start with our first director, François Truffaut, and the 400 coups.
Je veux toujours progresser, je voudrais faire mieux. Je pense souvent que j'aimerais mieux mes films si j'en étais le spectateur que l'auteur.
Truffaut is widely considered to be the father of the French New Wave movement. He first came onto the scene in 1959 with his directorial debut, Les 400 coups, aka The 400 Blows. The 400 Blows is a movie about young Parisian boy Antoine Donnel, who is surrounded by inconsiderate adults, including his neglectful parents. Because of this, him and his best friend commit small crimes, but one day, one of their schemes goes awry, and Antoine ends up in trouble with the law, getting him sent to the juvenile detention center. Within the movie, Truffaut uses on-site shooting, natural lighting, and long observational shots to help emphasize Antoine's loneliness and detachment from the society around him. This film ends with the iconic freeze frame and push-in of Antoine at the edge of the sea. The ending is left with ambiguities, which is another staple of these films, because most were not definitive endings and were left open to interpretation. Moving on, our next director is Jean-Luc Godard and his movie A Bout de Souffle, aka Breathless.
La photographie, c'est la vérité. Et le cinéma, c'est 24 fois la vérité par seconde.
Godard is one of the most well-known and influential directors in the New Wave, coming onto the movie scene with his first movie, Breathless, that would go on to win multiple awards around the world, cementing him as a key figure in the world of filmmaking. Breathless is a movie about Michael Picard, a small-time thief who steals a car and recklessly murders a policeman. On the run, he tries to persuade his American lover to run away with him. He's eventually caught by the police and is shot while running down the street. Drawing on American crime movies for inspiration while rejecting studio restraints, Godard shot Breathless on real Paris streets using lightweight cameras, natural light, and a flexible, rewritten daily script, allowing his actors to improvise how they want it. He would also utilize jump cuts, fracturing the time and rhythm within the scene. Our final French director is Agnès Varda with her movie Cléo 5 à 7, aka Cléo 5 to 7.
Je ne sais pas si j'ai un style. Je sais que j'ai un désir de cinéma qui passe par utiliser les images et le son d'une façon réelle.
Varda is considered to many to be the mother of French New Wave. She was a revolutionary figure, being the only prominent female director of the time. She was also not a part of the Cahiers du Cinéma, but rather another group called the Left Bank, who were a group of people that had already been slightly established in some sort of other art field. For Varda, she was a photographer and made one movie before called Le Pont Court, which is considered to be a predecessor to the French New Wave. Known for her ethereal female-focused movies, she became a staple in the French New Wave and an icon for the feminist movement in France in the 1970s. I honestly could make a whole video talking and analyzing Varda, but I won't. I'll save it. For now, let's move on to her classic film, Cléo 5 to 7. The story unfolds in real time as we follow young singer Cléo as she waits for the results of a medical test that might reveal she has cancer. Over 2 hours in Paris, she walks through the city, internally battling her fears of death and her fleeting beauty. She soon meets a soldier who is leaving that night to go back and fight in the Algerian War. They accompany each other and give each other comfort as Cléo goes to the hospital to receive her results. Varda shot Cléo from 5 to 7 in real time on the streets of Paris, using natural lighting, real locations, and a documentary-style spontaneity to capture what the city exactly felt like. She paired this with realism, symbolic imagery, mirrors, reflections, and subtle camera shifts to express Cléo's transformation over the 2 hours. This would become a staple in Varda's work.
Minute, beau papillon. Être laide, c'est ça la mort. Tant que je suis belle, je suis vivante et 10 fois plus que les autres.
Now that I've given you all the history and everything that I'm going to talk about in terms of French New Wave today, let's move on to Japanese New Wave. What is it, and what's the history behind it? Similar to Nouvelle Vogue, Japanese New Wave rejected traditional studio rules and the controlled, polished storytelling of early Japanese cinema in favor of handheld cameras, a mix of studio and on-site location shooting, and bold editing choices to explore taboo subjects such as youth rebellion, sexuality, politics, and post-war disillusionment. Similar to French New Wave, there is no single visual motif or theme in every movie, and the genres varied. So, how did this start? Let's take a look at the Ampo protests. The Ampo protests were a massive demonstration against the renewal of the US-Japan Security Treaty, which would allow US troops to stay on Japanese soil, which many young people saw as proof that Japan was still under Americans' influence even after World War II. This unrest exposed deep generational anger and a growing distrust of authority, especially among students and artists. After much protest, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Ichiro Kiyose, was dragged to his seat to start the vote. The protests sadly failed and the treaty went through. At the same time, film studio Shochiku was fighting to keep up with rival studios like Nikatsu, who were starting to embrace the Taiyo-zoku subculture emerging. So, they decided to lay all their cards on the table and give new directors full control. They took their naming inspiration from Nouvelle Vogue, which is why in Japan it's called Nubiru Bag. By giving these new directors the freedom to make movies about what they want, the growing frustrations with the government gave way to a deeply political and subversive topics within their movies. When things got too controversial for the studios, they pushed back against these directors. This caused a lot of them to move to independent studios and places like the Art Theater Guild. So, unlike France, Japan started in the studio and slowly gave way to independence in the system. But now, let's take a look at our Japanese directors and their movies. First, we'll start by looking at Nagisa Oshima and his movie, Cruel Story of Youth, and then look at Shohei Inamura and his movie, Pigs and Battleships. Nagisa Oshima was a central figure in the Japanese New Wave movement. Known for his provocative, politically charged films, he used handheld cameras, on-location shooting, and bold editing choices to explore themes like youth rebellion, sexuality, and post-war disillusionment. Films like Cruel Story of Youth showcased his willingness to confront taboo subjects and experiment with the narrative form, making him a key voice in Japan's cinematic revolution. Cruel Story of Youth follows young girl Makoto, a high school student, and Kiyoshi, a teenage delinquent, who pulls her into a toxic and exploitative relationship. Together, they trick old men by having Makoto seduce drivers, and when they come onto her, have Kiyoshi beat them up and extort them. They use this money to sustain their unstable lifestyle, but when Makoto becomes pregnant, they seek an illegal abortion. More things keep on happening, and their continued reckless behavior and toxic dependency ultimately ends in tragedy. Nagisa Oshima shot Cruel Story of Youth with handheld cameras, natural lighting, and on-location urban settings, giving the film a raw, documentary-like realism. The film's rough visual style, especially its bold use of deep reds and harsh shadows, became a hallmark of Oshima's early work and reflected the break from traditional, studio-controlled Japanese filmmaking. Let's take a look at our next director, Shohei Inamura. He was a major force of the Japanese New Wave, known for his raw, unfiltered portrayals of post-war Japanese society. He used documentary-style realism, crowded on-location environments, and handheld camera work, and natural sound to explore the lives of the working class and those just trying to survive. In the book 100 Years of Japanese Film, author Donald Ritchie states, "The characters in a Kawashima or Inamura film, as has often been noted, do not behave like Japanese, because none of the rules of order and decorum insist upon the official versions. These low-class folks do not know the meaning of fidelity. They are utterly unnatural, even uncivilized, to the extent that civilization means a removal from the natural. They are selfish, lusty, and amoral." Films like Pigs and Battleships reveal his bold mix of satire, social critique, and chaotic mise-en-scene, making him one of the movement's most distinctive and groundbreaking filmmakers. Now let's talk about Pigs and Battleships. Pigs and Battleships follows Kinta, a young Yakuza member trying to raise up in the ranks, and Haruko, his girlfriend who dreams of escaping their crime-ridden port town in Yokozuka. The U.S. Navy's presence fuels a thriving black market and red light district. Kinta is put in charge of a pig smuggling operation that uses leftover American military rations to raise illegal pigs. When a murder happens, the gang members must dispose of the body. Kinta is convinced to become the fall guy. Eventually, Haruko convinces Kinta to leave for the countryside, but he must deal with the loose ends with the pigs. This ultimately ends with a chaotic shootout involving Kinta, the Yakuza, police, and runaway pigs, leaving Haruko with a decision to stay or leave. Next, we move on to our last movement, New Hollywood. New Hollywood. What is it, and what's the history behind it? By the late 1950s and early 1960s, old Hollywood was completely out of touch with American audiences. Younger generations were living through the civil rights movement, Vietnam, the rise of counterculture, and a growing distrust of authority. Meanwhile, mainstream Hollywood films were still polished, moralistic, and controlled by an outdated censorship rules. Young people who were the main moviegoers didn't see themselves in these movies, and ticket sales dropped. At the same time, the Hays Code, which dictated a strict moral guideline since the 1930s, began to collapse. Its power weakened because of television stealing audience, the influence of foreign films, especially from Europe and Japan, and bold American directors openly challenging the censorship rules. The film industry technically followed the code until the late 50s, but by the mid-60s, it wasn't enforced at all. In 1968, the code was finally abandoned and replaced by the MPAA's new film rating system, which we all know today. This allowed filmmakers to explore adult themes without the fear of censorship. It became the watcher's decision whether or not to watch. Again, at the same time, Hollywood was still recovering from the Paramount case. This is when the Supreme Court forced studios to give up their theater chains and end block booking. This weakened studio system opened the space for new voices. When the industry was financially unstable and culturally disconnected, film studios took a gamble on new directors just exiting film school. Remember Nouvelle Vogue? Those directors didn't go to school, but these ones did. thus the first generation of American directors with formal cinematic education. These would become known as the movie brats. This included Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and Brian De Palma, along a long list of many others. They grew up watching both classic Hollywood and foreign films like our French and Japanese New Wave. They brought techniques to Hollywood that they saw in other movements: location shooting, handheld cameras, non-traditional editing, and morally ambiguous characters, and crafted films that matched the energy and cynicism of the era. Movies like Bonnie and Clyde and Taxi Driver helped redefine America's cinema and solidify New Hollywood as one of the most influential film movements in history. Now let's take a look at our two American directors and their movies: Bonnie and Clyde by Arthur Penn and Taxi Driver by Martin Scorsese. Arthur Penn was a central figure in the emergence of New Hollywood, known for blending European techniques with gritty American storytelling. He used on-location shooting, handheld camera work, jump cuts, and morally ambiguous characters to break the controlled polish of old Hollywood. His film, Bonnie and Clyde, was widely credited with launching the New Wave Hollywood movement and was heavily influenced by the French New Wave, particularly Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard, both who were originally approached to direct the film. By combining French New Wave-inspired editing, graphic violence, and countercultural themes, the film redefines audience expectations and director freedom. Its historical and cultural significance has been recognized, and it has been preserved in the Library of Congress. Now let's talk about Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie and Clyde follows the real-life story of Bonnie Parker, a restless waitress, and Clyde Barrow, a charming small-time thief, who fall into a romantic relationship fueled by adrenaline and money that quickly spirals into a cross-country spree of bank robberies and murder during the Great Depression. As their crimes escalate, the couple becomes both folk heroes and dangerous outlaws. Their fame fueled by the public's fascination with rebellion during hard economic times, Bonnie and Clyde became a landmark film that helped ignite the New Hollywood movement, signaling a generational shift towards riskier, director-driven American filmmaking. Now let's look at our next and last director, Martin Scorsese. Scorsese is a defining figure in New Hollywood, known for his gritty, character-driven films that explore crime, morality, and urban alienation. He draws inspiration from old Hollywood classics, particularly gangster films, as well as French New Wave directors like Jean-Luc Godard. He incorporates techniques of handheld cameras, location shooting, jump cuts, and bold narrative experimentation. Films like Taxi Driver showcase his mastery of tension, anti-hero storytelling, and social critique, solidifying his reputation as one of the most influential directors of the New Hollywood, and so on. Now his film Taxi Driver follows Travis, a lonely, mentally unstable Vietnam veteran driving taxis through the decaying streets of 1970s New York. He becomes fixated on Betsy, a campaign worker, but after her rejection, Travis spirals deep into resentment, paranoia, and an obsession with morality. His fixation shifts to Iris, a 12-year-old prostitute whom he has become determined to save from her manipulative pimp. As his mental state deteriorates, Travis channels his anger into an assassination attempt on the presidential candidate, Charles Palantine, whom Betsy works for. When that plan fails, Travis redirects his mission towards Iris, culminating in a brutal shootout meant to free her. This act blurs the line between heroism and delusion. The French New Wave stylistic influences become even more apparent when we look at specific scenes from Japanese New Wave and New Hollywood filmmaking styles. In Breathless, Godard opens up with Michael stealing a car, smoking while talking directly into the camera before abruptly shooting a police officer. It establishes a point of discontinuity. The jump cuts fracture time, handheld tracking destabilizes space, and the violence is depicted through suggestion rather than spectacle. This aesthetic resurfaces in Cruel Story of Youth, particularly during Makoto's early assault sequences. Like Godard, Oshima refuses a conventional depiction of violence. He uses fragmented cutting, obscure angles, and abrupt tonal shifts to create ambiguity about what has occurred. I mean, when I first watched it, I didn't even know what was happening because of how it was filmed. Both scenes omit important details to show youth culture's recklessness while denying the audience the comfort of clarity. The next one I want to look at is from 400 Blows. It's when Antony reaches the ocean and he confronts his uncertain future in one long, unbroken stare. It's just like Haruko from Pigs and Battleships. Her final walk away from the chaos of Yokozuka mirrors that same ambiguity. Both endings are unresolved, leaving our young protagonist swinging between failure and the faint possibility of potential freedom. Another one from Pigs and Battleships is Quinta's final run after he's been wounded. This closely mirrors what we saw earlier in Michael's scene in Breathless when he is wounded and running down the street in one long take. Each sequence uses extended handheld tracking and strips each one of the criminals from their glamour, and at the end they are both collapsed in an unromantic and unheroic scene. The next one I want to look at is from Cléo 5-7, Cleo's mirror shots, and from Taxi Driver, Travis's mirror monologue. Both use the mirror as a tool to reveal their inner thoughts, but they're on opposite ends. Cleo's reflection fractures her self-image and her self-worth, exposing her anxieties under her persona, while Travis uses the mirror to reaffirm a fantasy that he has made up in his head that defines him as a hero. Both are inner reflections of how they're feeling. The last one I want to look at is from Bonnie and Clyde, where jump cuts and tonal shifts in moments like a motel seduction scene destabilize the romantic outlaws. Penn's film is heavily influenced by Truffaut and Guitar. In fact, Truffaut helped write Bonnie and Clyde partially. He adopts new wave jump cut editing styles, especially in the robbery and the shootout sequences, and it is amplified with sudden bursts of graphic violence, and it was a combination that became foundational to these new Hollywood movies. Across these movements, individual scenes reveal a shared cinematic evolution: handheld cameras, moral ambiguity, on-site filming, jump cuts, and violence that's portrayed on screen not just as spectacle, but as a story to be told. Together, these techniques form a transnational conversation in which French New Wave experimentation became the blueprint for Japanese New Wave rebellion and New Hollywood reinvention. So let's get this right. Classic Hollywood films inspired French New Wave inspired Japanese New Wave, and they both would go on to inspire New Hollywood. New Hollywood would eventually go on to inspire more Japanese and French cinema, which in turn continues to inspire contemporary American filmmaking. What this cycle makes clear is that everyone influences everyone all the time. What really matters are the historical context in which films are made, the audience they are made for, and the cultural influence in which they emerge from. Cinema evolves not through isolated instances, but through a continuous global conversation and inspiration. Thank you for watching.